All right, guys, I really think this is just me in my backyard talking to nobody but myself. But if you've made it this far, then you've made it to the sixth and final video of today's class, looking at Socrates. And, I should probably make these videos about. I think some teachers will be like, today we're talking about diabetes, and next week we're talking about nutrition, and the week after we're talking, and I'm just like, every day we're doing a little bit more of this giant book. I could probably organize it. I mean, it's interesting that I'm teaching about Socrates, and Socrates' complaint is that people don't organize their speeches, and here I am. And the only principle of organization I have is let's do a little more each day. That's partly because I've never taught this before, and if I had taught it a bunch of times, I would have like a different sense about how to. I'd have more experience with it, and I would know, well, I want to start here and go here and go here. But as it is, I'm just going through it in order. So let's talk about. Oh, although this is an advanced thing that I feel like talking about. Remember, one of the things we talked about in this video, in this series, was about how it's not very well organized. Socrates talks about how Lysias' speech was not very well organized, and he gives that joke about the epitaph on Midas's grave, which had different. In which it had 4 lines of poetry, but you could rearrange the order of them and it didn't make any sense. There's a larger issue that we could talk about in here, and this is really a more advanced kind of philosophy class sort of discussion, and it's really an art discussion and a philosophy discussion, and this is a composition class, and so what I'm giving you here is slightly advanced, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, because I feel like talking about it, and it's this. For like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, people didn't like this book. People love Plato. Plato's super important, but people thought this was actually one of Plato's worst books. Why? Well, for the exact reason Socrates says. People feel like this book isn't organized. Usually, when you get a book of philosophy, it's about one thing, right? Like, here is a book about love. Here is a book about politics. Here is a book about ethics. Here is a book about, what kinds of things are sandwiches. And people for hundreds and hundreds of years, they thought the Phaedrus was a piece of garbage. Why? Because it keeps changing subjects, right? Part 1 was about, like, should you marry someone who's in love with you? And then part 2 is sort of about love, but it's about this very different kind of religious love that has to do with an intellectual love for ideas, not for people, right? We start off talking about romance and should you marry somebody who's in love with you or not? And then it switches into a kind of intellectual love, or what you really love are these sort of big philosophical ideas, and it's about why philosophy is important. And then the third section is about writing. And it's Phaedrus and Socrates sitting around talking about what should good writing look like. And it's really funny that one of the things Socrates says is that books ought to be carefully organized. And here we have Plato's Phaedrus, which starts off about romantic love, then becomes about intellectual love, and then suddenly changes subjects into what makes good writing different from bad writing. And so it's very interesting. Socrates, you can see, I don't know, it's hard to see, but he has a little bit of a sense of humor. He's being silly. He's kind of messing with people sometimes. Plato also has a sense of humor. And I think part of Plato's sense of humor is he has Socrates bitching about organization in a book that's not that organized. And this is going to get worse as we go. There's another big, weird joke coming that I'll just prepare you for now. But later on, in the next couple of pages, Socrates is going to say, writing is bad and cannot be trusted. And that's hilarious because it's in a book by Plato, a book that Plato wrote down. So it's literally a book. It's a piece of writing that tells you writing is bad. But we'll get to that when we get to it. For now, I just wanted to point out that people thought this book wasn't organized. And by the way, I will say one of the reasons why I selected it for our class is because it is unorganized. Because it doesn't stay on one topic all the time. I thought it'd be more interesting. Like if I got a book about ethics, we'd have to talk about ethics all semester long, and we would never be able to change subjects. Whereas I like this book because it allows us to stick with one book for the entire class. It allows us to, I'm trying a new thing where you're like walking side by side with me. I got this book because I thought it allows us to study one book, but several different subjects in the one book. And I thought that'd be something more fun because we could change subjects a lot. So actually, it was the disorganization of the book that I really admired because I thought it would be more fun to teach. Whereas Plato has a giant book about like politics, and I just don't want to talk about politics all semester long. All right, so let's take a look in here just do a little bit more before we stop for the day. So Socrates is talking about all these different people and these tricks they've come up with, and he keeps listing them off. For Prodicus, and then Socrates brings up Hippias, the Elon, the stranger, who agrees with them, and Paulus, who has treasuries of diplothology, nomology, iconology, who teaches them the names of which, blah, I'm not doing this. The point of this is that they all have these little specialized areas. Nomology is like the study of sayings. Like, I think I have to look that up. I think it's the sayings, like you find in a fortune cookie. Iconology is a study of images. The point is that these guys are so fancy and they use all these fancy words, but all their fancy words, it's just cover for the fact that they don't know what they're talking about. They have these little specialized areas of study and they claim they're going to teach you about this and that, but it's all tricks. It's all tricks for getting people to agree with you. And that is something people go to school to learn, but it's not the truth. And if you're not interested in the truth, then Socrates is not interested in you. You are doing something else. You are doing something bad. Socrates says, I have now said all that I have to say about the art of rhetoric. Have you anything to add? And Phaedrus says, not much, nothing very important. And Socrates says, well, leave the unimportant. So he's done. So that was their discussion of like what speech making, rhetoric, and persuasive writing is. He says, leave the unimportant and let us bring the really important question into the light of day, which is, what power has this art of rhetoric and when? So the section we've looked at today was Socrates defining what he likes to define things. You know, he loves to define stuff. And so this was his discussion of what is rhetoric, and he divides it into sections, and he talks about organization and all the little tricks that people use to convince people. And that's what it is. It's just a bag of tricks. And now Socrates moves on to say, okay, here's my next question then. What kind of power does rhetoric have? And Phaedrus says, a very great power in public meetings. Because Phaedrus is thinking of when you have a meeting, like when all the town gets together to debate something, if you're good at public speaking, you're going to be able to convince people to agree with you. Trials, legal trials, are open to the public. And that, again, is a kind of public meeting where lawyers will say, this guy is guilty, this guy is innocent. And if they have the power to persuade, the power to use words to get what they want, then they're going to be very effective in those public meetings. So I'm going to get to the end of this, and we're going to stop for the day. We're really close here. So he says, he says it has. Socrates agrees with him. It's good for public meetings. But I should like to know whether you have the same feeling I have about rhetoricians. There seem to me a great many holes in their web, right? Meaning that they seem to have a lot of power, but it's actually not as real as they think it is. Because, you know, a web has actually a lot of holes in it where things can slip through. And Socrates feels like what's the thing that slips through? The truth. They can capture the minds of people, but they can't capture the truth because they're not interested in the truth. They're only interested in convincing people. And Socrates gives an example here. He says, give an example. I will. See, just like I ask you guys to give an example, Socrates gives an example. Suppose a person comes to your friend or to his father and says to him, I know how to apply drugs which will have either a heating or a cooling effect, can give a vomit or a purge, and all that sort of thing. And knowing all of this as I do, I claim to be a physician, and to make physicians by imparting this knowledge to others. What do you suppose they would say? Phaedrus said, well, they would be sure to ask whether he knew to whom he would give his medicines and when and how much. So Socrates thinks that teaching people how to be persuasive speakers is a little bit like learning about drugs from the internet. Just because you learn some things about drugs on the internet does not make you a medical professional. There's a difference, a big difference, between learning what drugs do to the body from internet research and actually being a doctor who is qualified to understand the larger issues, because the medicine is a big complicated. Just because you know what 4 or 5 different drugs do doesn't make you a doctor. And Socrates says just because you can convince people of the truth doesn't make you a philosopher, because you don't really know what the truth is. And so Socrates is in the next section. Socrates is going to look into the power that rhetoric has. Socrates is very worried about rhetoric and persuasive speaking because he thinks it leads people astray. It leads them into error, and it messes up everything. Because here's the key thing. Socrates thinks that persuasive speaking is about getting people to agree with you, but that's just about personal power in this world, and it's just about persuasion and opinion. You got to get people's opinions, change their opinions. But Socrates is not interested in opinion. He's interested in truth. Okay, I'll pick it up next time. Thanks for getting through this. I hope you guys are all doing out there okay in crazy COVID land. And we will just continue this insane experiment as we go. Please comment. I'm feeling very lonely.